Okay, this is chapter 6, and we are talking about schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. Okay, so let's get started here. There we are, title. Okay, so schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is actually a very broad term. Okay, there are so many different types of, or let's say a range of different types of behaviors that are included in this category of schizophrenia. Okay, it includes a set of disorders in which individuals experience some sort of distorted perception of reality, some sort of distorted impairment in thinking, in behavior, in affect, and in motivation. Okay, often people have issues with all of these things. Sometimes they have issues with some of these things. Now, I want to talk about the term affect here. So this term right here, when we talk about that, in case you're not familiar with that term, affect is how somebody appears. So if somebody has, a flat affect, they don't change the expression on their face. If somebody has, and we will talk about this, an inappropriate affect, that means they may be laughing when something is sad or crying when something is happy. But generally, you do want to know what that word is. Okay, so this is a disorder with a range of symptoms, right? We see disturbances in content of thought, the formation of thought, in perception, in affect, in sense of self, in motivation, in behaviors, and in interpersonal functioning. Okay? So I do want you to know the difference between a delusion and a hallucination. Okay? So a delusion is a false belief. A delusion is a deeply entrenched false belief that is not consistent with the client's intellectual or cultural background. Okay, so it's not a cultural belief that somebody else doesn't agree with. It is just on their own delusional false belief. Okay, several types of delusions can be experienced by people with this disorder. I do want you to know the differences in these types of delusions. Okay, so first we talk about delusions of grandeur. Okay, and this is one that people talk about often, are these delusions of grandeur. And this is a grossly exaggerated concept of the individual's own importance. Okay, people have delusions ranging from beliefs that they have an important role in society to the belief that the person is actually Jesus or Napoleon or Hitler or whoever it is. Somebody may actually believe that they are that person. At one point in my education and career, I worked in a residential facility. A residential facility means that these individuals are not in the hospital, but they really can't live on their own at this point. So they live in sort of a group setting, okay? In this group setting, there were a lot of people with schizophrenia. I have a lot of favorite things, but one of my favorite things that somebody came to me and said, and these individuals speak to you as though these things are facts. So they just are. And this guy said to me, hey, there are several Jesuses. I always thought there was one Jesus, but turns out there's many Jesuses. And I said, oh, that's interesting. How do you know that? And he said, oh, well, I was in the main sitting room and, Bill told me he's Jesus, and Fred told me he's Jesus, and, Bob told me he's Jesus, right? Yeah. You like my generic names there. I'm clearly not good at coming up with generic names. But he was serious. He's like, wow, I learned something new today. Because these guys truly each individually believed that they were Jesus. And if you on your own have some schizophrenia symptoms going on and figuring out what's real and what's not real is confusing, well, maybe these guys are all right. That is all correct. Okay, so the delusions of grandeur, again, it may be that they believe that they are somebody, but often what we see is somebody thinks that they are just significantly more important than they are, that they are responsible for economic growth or economic crisis, that they are in some way amazingly important and they're going to figure out how to solve the world's problems, and they are brilliant and they are better than anyone else that's ever existed, and that they are the greatest person alive, right? This is a delusion. There's nobody that should feel that way about themselves. We should have self-esteem, but nobody should believe that they know more than anyone else, or that they are better than everybody else, or that they are smarter than everyone else. Okay, moving on. Control. So this is the feeling that one is being controlled by others, okay, or controlled by machines or appliances. The example that the book gives is a man may believe that his actions are being controlled by the radio, which is forcing him to perform certain actions against his will. Okay, so sometimes you'll have somebody that comes in that says, I don't want to sit in this room, but I will sit in this other room with you because, as you know, this room has that control tower on the ceiling, and then I won't be able to, move my own body. It will just happen, kind of thing. Okay, delusions of reference. Here's the next one. This is the belief that the behavior of others or certain objects or events are personally referring to oneself. Okay, for example, a woman believes that a soap opera is really telling the story of her life. Or a man believes that sales items at a local market are targeted at his own particular dietary deficiencies. Okay, so that is that things are related to this person. It's again a little bit of a delusion of kind of a self-importance, if you will, but the idea that things that are happening in the world are related to them specifically, even if they are someone who, let's say, never leaves their home. Okay, so have somebody that talks about how maybe he sees things on the news, and the way that they're talking about things, he thinks that maybe they're talking about the time that he had this incident, and they're really on the news and they're talking about one thing, but they really mean something related to him. Okay, that's a delusion of reference. Now, delusions of persecution. This one is a little bit more, well, in my opinion, sad than some of the others, and that is the belief that another person or persons are trying to inflict harm on the individual or on the individual's family or social group. Okay, and this is a delusion. For example, a woman feels that an organized group of politically liberal individuals attempting to destroy the right-wing political organization for which she belongs. Now, this is not the best example, right? Because sometimes these things, happen in some ways, right? And of course, this example says one way can always be the other way. Point being, the idea is that this is maybe a person who lives in her own home, stays by herself, but she believes that something is happening that is not happening. Okay, usually, as a bad example, usually people that have delusions of persecution are somebody who thinks that other people are poisoning them, or they walk into a restaurant and they believe that everyone is talking about them. Okay, they believe people are out to get them. And like I said, it's kind of a sad one because they live their lives in this belief that others are wanting to hurt them. And sometimes those are people that actually do love them, that they believe are trying to hurt them. And that's hard on families also. Okay, we're going to move on. Delusions of self-blame. This is also a hard one. This is feelings of remorse without justification. Okay, for example, a man holds himself responsible for famine in Africa because of certain unkind or sinful actions he believes he committed. And this one we see often, and that is, again, let's say somebody believes that because they weren't nice to people in high school, that is why, 9/11 happened. And they are leaps, if you will, right? So these are sort of self-blame delusions, tend to be leaps from I did this and therefore this catastrophic thing has happened that is in no way related to that person, but they really feel terrible about it, as though they actually have caused it. Okay, delusions, somatic delusions. Okay, somatic delusions are inappropriate concerns about one's body, okay, related to disease. For example, without justification, a woman believes she has brain cancer. Okay, adding an even more bizarre note, she believes that ants have invaded her head and are eating away at her brain, right? These are somatic or bodily delusions. Delusions of infidelity, false beliefs usually associated with, pathological jealousy involving the notion that one's lover is being unfaithful, right? And no matter what, you cannot convince this person that their spouse is not cheating on them. They're sure of it. Okay, thought broadcasting. This is the idea that one's thoughts are being broadcast to others, so other people can read their minds. Other people can hear what they're thinking. Okay? Thought insertion is the belief that outside forces are inserting thoughts into one's mind. For example, a woman concludes that her thoughts are not her own, but that are being placed there to control or upset her. Okay? So, thought broadcasting, thought insertion. Now, so that is delusions. Delusion is false beliefs. Hallucinations are false perceptions. Okay, false perceptions that do not correspond to the object or stimuli present in the environment. People have hallucinations of lots of different sensory modalities. So vision, hearing, smell, touch. I knew one person that had taste hallucinations. These can be upsetting or friendly, right? Some people have hallucinations of having a buddy, right? Like when you're 3, you may have an imaginary friend. That's adorable. When you are, 30, if you have an imaginary friend, we're going to call it a hallucination. Let's see. I'm going to go back to this for a minute. Hallucinations can also kind of take on those same kind of ideas. You can have persecutory hallucinations. You can have, again, like I said, hallucinations that are friendly or not friendly. Again, at this residential place, had a guy who was hallucinating. Basically, the TV would be on in the main area, and whenever Oprah would come on, people like Oprah, right? Generally. Whenever Oprah would come on, he'd get very upset because he would hallucinate every single time that Oprah was cussing at him, like cursing him specifically, and he could hear her. So it wasn't that he believed that she was thinking it. It was that he could hear her saying terrible things to him. So we often tried to make sure he wasn't in the room when Oprah was on. Okay, let's talk about some other things. Deficits of speech and language. Okay, sometimes you have this language that's incomprehensible or incoherent, and we call that disorganized speech. If you've ever been out and you've walked by somebody who's sort of mumbling nonsensical things to themselves or to you, this is disorganized speech. This person is most likely not dangerous in any way. They're just having a conversation that makes no sense. The thought process underlying this type of speech reflects what we call loosening of associations. Loose associations, meaning they're going from one topic to another topic to another topic that typically most people don't think makes sense. Okay, this is characterized by a flow of thoughts that is vague, it's unfocused, and it's illogical. Now, we have this word here, but what I really like to talk about is, let's see, I'm going to write something here. I don't know, stupid grid. Clang And well, let's talk about clang. Clang is interesting because clang is when people rhyme. It's really cool. I mean, it's upsetting for them because they can't seem to stop it, but every sentence, every two sentences seems to rhyme, or many, many, many sentences in a row, or thoughts rhyme. And they're not trying, they're not making an effort to do so. It's just that as they talk, they rhyme. Okay? Another one that you might hear is word salad. Okay, and word salad is simply just nonsensical. So it is like, you know, table my friend's egg tissues. You know what I'm talking about? That kind of thing, right? Word salad is a bunch of different words and thoughts shoved together in one sentence that for anyone listening makes no sense. Okay. Ready to move on? I know, I put a lot of information out at you. Hopefully you take notes. All right, you can always come back. Some other symptoms of schizophrenia we have is this affect that I was talking about before. Inappropriate affect is the extent to which a person's emotional expressiveness fails to correspond with the content of what's being discussed. Okay, so again, like I said, they make a confused face when you say something that makes total sense. They laugh when you're talking about something sad. They cry when you talk about something happy. It's inappropriate facial expressions. Okay? Paranoia. Paranoia is the irrational fear or perception that others wish to cause you harm. It may be associated with delusions. It may be associated with auditory hallucinations related to a theme that somebody is persecuting or harassing them. Okay? So again, you may have the person that comes in that says, well, you know, I don't like to talk in here because, as you know, this room is connected to, you know, that thing on the roof that is sending signals to the CIA, and the CIA is listening to what I'm talking about, right? So being followed by the CIA, FBI, those kinds of things usually is one of our symptoms of schizophrenia called paranoia. Okay. I put in here catatonia because I do want to mention this also. This sometimes you see and sometimes you do not. Catatonia is bodily rigidity. You may have heard the term used in a different way. I pulled something up here. So part of catatonia is something called waxy flexibility. I find waxy flexibility to be really interesting. So catatonia is that rigid body stays in one place. Waxy flexibility is someone, typically with schizophrenia, where you can move their arm, you can move their head, you can move this person in a different way, and they stay there. And they stay in that position. I found this really old clip that I'm going to show you. I don't know why. I like the old clips. Okay.
Like a warm candlestick, the body of the patient can be contorted into almost any posture. The patient may maintain the posture for several minutes.
Okay, there's no sound here, but you can see that this person is, you see even just like the little hand movements, right? There's rigidity, there's catatonia, but there's this waxy flexibility. And they stay this way, and they stay in these what we would consider awkward positions literally for hours if you don't move them, right? So the kind thing to do, of course, is to help put their arms back down where they won't have muscles hurting later. Okay? All right. So we're going to go back. Going back. Now remember, with any of these words that we talk about, you can look things up on the internet. When it comes to schizophrenia, sometimes you get some odd stuff. So do be aware You know how to cautiously use YouTube, I assume, at this point. But you can look up like inappropriate affect, flat affect, any of those things, any of the other words that we talked about before. Okay, the next thing I want you to know the difference between is positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Okay, when you have someone with schizophrenia, they exhibit what we call positive symptoms, and they exhibit negative symptoms. Okay, so positive symptoms are the things that we as outsiders may really notice. We notice their exaggerations, their hallucinations. We notice their delusions. We notice their affect. We notice all of these types of things, okay? Negative symptoms involve functioning below the level of normal behavior. Now, let's talk more specifically here, okay? Negative symptoms are reported to be more upsetting sometimes to the person who has schizophrenia than the positive symptoms. The positive symptoms are things that the rest of us notice, and we may not notice the negative symptoms. Okay, negative symptoms are like the restricted affect. Okay, so I mentioned affect and positive symptoms also, and that is more so if they are outgoing or really out there, things we see. Okay, so more of that restricted affect, meaning there's some restricted emotion that's happening also. We have avolition. Avolition basically means lack of motivation. Okay, so this idea of lack of motivation is a really kind of nice way to put it, but lack of interest in doing anything in the world, right? Asociality, the person just kind of doesn't care about being around others. They don't really like being around others. They don't want to. And you see that, okay? So we have both these positive and negative symptoms. So here we go. Delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disturbed behavior, restricted affect, avolition, and asociality. Researchers proposed that positive symptoms reflected activated dopamine levels in the nervous system, and negative symptoms seem to be related even more to abnormalities in brain structure. Okay, so Bueller coined the term schizophrenia, right? He came up with these 4 A's, and that is association, affect, ambivalence, and autism. Now, autism here does not mean exactly what we've talked about before with autism, but that is that there's thought disorder, there's emotional disturbance, there's inability to make or follow through with decisions, and there's withdrawal from reality. Okay, so now when we talk about schizophrenia, we talk about schizophrenia as a spectrum disorder. So it's now classified as this spectrum disorder rather than a single disease. So now we have new diagnostic categories, personality and affective disorders. Okay, in section 3 of the DSM-5, you get a set of symptom severity ratings. Okay, and so with this diagnosis now, unlike in the DSM-4, you didn't do this. In the DSM-5, you're supposed to do this. So that is with each of these categories here, you're going to rate the severity. So severity of hallucinations, the severity of the delusions, the severity of disorganized speech, the severity of abnormal psychomotor behavior. Psychomotor behavior meaning bodily, motions. We're going to rate the severity of negative symptoms, rate the severity of impaired cognition, of depression, and of mania, if these things are relevant. Okay? So again, just note that this is a symptom severity rating that is now done in the DSM-5 and was not performed in the DSM-4 or before that. Okay, let's talk statistics. Men and women are equally likely over the course of their lifetimes to develop schizophrenia. Women typically develop the disorder later in life. Researchers estimate that lifetime prevalence is about 1%. People with schizophrenia are 2 to 3 times more likely to die compared to others within their age group. I giggle because, I mean, everybody's going to die. We're not more likely to die, but to die within that age group than other people their age group. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And again, we don't exactly know why that is. That may be because, they're more likely to be victims of crime. They are more likely to not seek help if they are sick. They are more, it's possible that they're just brain structure abnormalities that are occurring that lead to this. But there's all those things. Okay. When we talk about onset, the typical age of onset for someone with schizophrenia is in their late teens and early 20s. So you have some things that people may or may not notice before this, but then that time comes up in their lives and they have what we call a psychotic break. So keep an eyeball on your friends. Okay, course of schizophrenia. It may take one of several courses. Okay, the course and outcome are poorer for people with schizophrenia than other psychological disorders. Okay, you have continuous schizophrenia. That should make sense. You have people that just continue to have these issues consistently. You have remission, and that is that someone is showing psychotic symptoms and they have periods of time where they don't show psychotic symptoms anymore. We have recurrent, and I actually have never heard of extended. Well, we'll have to look that up, won't we? I'll look that up and get back to you on that one, or you can look it up. Basically, I'm not going to ask about it on the exam because I'm not that familiar with it. So there. Okay, continuous remission, recurrent. You will see in your book, they do have an example of a woman who has schizophrenia, is living a fabulously productive life. You have individuals who have one psychotic break and are immediately treated and have a good support system and are on medication, and they may never have an issue again. You have other people who may have, schizophrenia issues throughout their entire life. Okay. Moving on here, other psychotic disorders, okay? So other psychotic disorders are schizophrenia-like disorders that involve abnormalities in one or more of these domains: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, grossly disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, and negative symptoms. Okay, our first one here is brief psychotic disorder. Now, with brief psychotic disorder and schizophreniform, we look at how long of a period we're talking about, okay? So this is a diagnosis that clinicians use when an individual develops symptoms of psychosis that don't persist past a short period of time. Sometimes people call this a nervous breakdown. If we just say, like, for some reason, they just kind of had a break with reality. They had some psychotic symptoms, but they seem okay now. We don't know what was up with that. Okay, so symptoms must be present for more than one day, but recover in less than a month. Okay, so from 1 day to a month, we call it brief psychotic disorder. Symptoms are your same things: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and disorganized or catatonic behavior. Okay, schizophreniform is the same thing. However, we're talking about the time difference. So schizophreniform is 1 month to 6 months. Okay, brief psychotic disorder, then we change it to a diagnosis of schizophreniform if it's 1 to 6 months. Now, I should say this, then after 6 months, it's schizophrenia. So you actually don't diagnose schizophrenia unless someone has had the symptoms for 6 or more months. Do know that. Schizophrenia, you have to have the symptoms for 6 or more months. Schizophreniform, 1 to 6 months. Okay, then we have schizoaffective disorder. Remember that affective? It's about mood. So schizophrenia co-occurring with a mood disorder. So somebody has either depression or mania or a mixed episode of depression and mania. So they have both schizophrenia and mood symptoms. Okay. We also have delusional disorders. This is a disorder in which only the symptoms are delusions that have lasted for at least 1 month. Sorry, the only symptoms are delusions, okay? So there's no hallucinations at all, just delusions, delusional disorder. We have different types of delusions. I do want you to know the difference in these. This is basically erotomanic. So the idea is, I think the example they use in your book is like, oh, the president and his wife are having marital problems, and even though I've never met them and they've never met me, I think it's because the wife is in love with me. Okay, so there's that. Grandiose, same thing as we talked about before, delusions of feeling this wildly inflated self-esteem. Okay, I'm smarter, I'm better, I know everything more than anybody else knows. Jealous, it's pretty self-explanatory. Persecutory, we talked about this before, but you think that other people are out to get you or are talking about you. Somatic, bodily symptoms. There's something called shared psychotic disorder. And this is not necessarily within the delusional disorders. I just wanted to make sure that we got to talk about it. Shared psychotic disorder is when you have more than one person that believes the same psychotic thoughts or the same delusion. Okay, and often this happens, for example, let's say a mother is psychotic and has very specific delusions, persecutory delusions. She tells her children these things every day, every day, every day. The children believe it because they don't know what else to believe. They believe what mom says, right? So there is that shared psychotic disorder. This also happens with adults, right? So if you think about kind of cult-like things, and sometimes at a lower level than a cult, but you have a shared psychotic disorder. Okay, now let's talk about theories here. So biological theories. Schizophrenia reflects a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and sociocultural forces. I like that sentence. Okay, so let's break it down. Brain structures and genetics. First, we look at ventricular enlargements. And this is, I should have had a thing here, but this is enlarged spaces holding cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so enlarged ventricles. Often this happens along with cortical atrophy. Atrophy meaning sort of the wasting away of brain tissue. If you're not familiar with the word atrophy, if you've ever worn a cast, and once they take the cast off, you can see your muscle just kind of like flops there. That's atrophy, and you have to sort of build it back up. So cortical atrophy would be the wasting away of brain tissue. Interestingly, we often see it, well, at first they really saw it only in the prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobes. Interestingly, the prefrontal cortex is for making decisions and thinking about the future and planning ahead, and the temporal lobe is for hearing and auditory information. Now they really see it more sort of widespread, and the idea is that there's an interference with integration of information. So your brain's having trouble integrating the information. Okay. One of the things that they use now is this diffusion tensor imaging, and it really measures this, right? It measures connectivity. It measures how well is your brain communicating with other parts of your brain. Last here we have the dopamine hypothesis, and this is that dopamine is related to schizophrenia. Okay, so when we think about the neurotransmitter that is related to schizophrenia, we talk about dopamine. Interestingly, dopamine is also the neurotransmitter that we see associated with Parkinson's disease. Okay, and Parkinson's disease includes rigid movements and some, rigid movements and some psychomotor agitation is what we'd call it. So the motor movements, right? Just the motor movements. So what we seem to see is that schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease are on two opposite sides of this dopamine, spectrum. And interestingly, when someone has schizophrenia, if their medications are too high, then they start showing more symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Okay? And if we have someone with Parkinson's disease and their medications are too high, then they start showing schizophrenia-like symptoms. And this we want to keep an eye out for, right? So if you have a family member with Parkinson's and they start showing some psychotic symptoms, you can say, hey, somebody needs to call their doctor. Their medication levels are not quite right. If you see somebody with schizophrenia who is struggling, then you can say, hey, are you struggling with sort of motor movements, something that we're going to talk about, which is tardive dyskinesia and extrapyramidal movements. Then you can say, hey, I think that their medication is too high. We really should have the physician check their blood levels. Okay. So genetic abnormalities within the biological theories, we look at brain development, we look at synaptic transmission, that's typically with the dopamine there. We talk about immune functioning. We talk about manufacturing of important proteins involved with neurotransmission. So there's a lot of stuff that could be and is going on. We have this neurodevelopmental hypothesis. Okay, so the neurodevelopmental hypothesis is simply this: the development of the disorder that arises during the years of adolescence or early adulthood due to alterations in the genetic control of brain maturation. Okay. And that is, again, so as the brain is developing, that there's alterations and things that are happening that don't happen the way they should for someone to not have schizophrenia. There's this term neuroplasticity, and that neuroplasticity is the idea that our brains can really alter themselves. So there's always the story about like the guy that gets shot in the head and is still living, right? And this is the amazing piece of neuroplasticity. Now, some people die, but if you don't, your brain starts to form connections in different ways so that it can still function. It alters itself, it changes. What we seem to see in patients with schizophrenia is a loss of neuroplasticity. And that is that the brain is altering in a way that it maybe shouldn't, and the brain does not correct itself. It doesn't alter itself in order to fix the issue. Okay. So we have something called neuroleptics. Neuroleptics are also called antipsychotics. Usually people use the term antipsychotic. We have typical or first generation antipsychotics, and we have atypical or second generation antipsychotics. Some of the big side effects that are a problem are what we call extrapyramidal symptoms. And those are, again, those motor rigidity, maybe people shuffle their feet as they walk, and something called tardive dyskinesia. You may want to look that up if you want to see what that looks like. Some people call tardive dyskinesia lip smacking or pill rolling. If you've ever seen somebody who just sort of like does this repetitive motor movement with their mouth that is, if you think about sort of rolling your tongue while you're, I can make a noise, but you can't see me. So you may want to look it up. And the idea is that this is a motor issue. So this is not a psychological thing that's happened, but the medication side effects has created this repetitive motor movement. Now, sometimes for people, once they have this, they cannot get rid of it. So going off the medication doesn't stop it. For other people, they will have a remission of this issue. Okay, so the idea is that our typical or first generation antipsychotics really had these pretty nasty side effects if they were used at doses that were too high. They also did not deal with the negative symptoms. So they really only addressed the positive symptoms and not the negative symptoms. So now we have what we call atypical antipsychotics or second generation antipsychotics. These are the typical ones prescribed are Risperdal, Zyprexa, and Seroquel. The idea was that these should be better as far as side effects. I mean, they may be a little bit better, but you still have to keep an eye on these things. They are still side effects. These things can still happen. You just want to make sure that if you know somebody or you are taking these medications, that you have your doctor continuously check your blood levels, see where you are, make sure everything's good so that you don't end up with these issues, okay? I've definitely had clients on these medications that do fabulously on them. They will deal with the side effects in order to be able to not be psychotic, okay? And the second generation or atypical antipsychotics are supposed to help out more with the negative symptoms also. Sometimes, though, you really just need a second medication. Okay. From the psychological perspective, we see deficits in social cognition. We see brains that become less activated when given a social task. We see difficulty in working on people-oriented jobs. And often we see substance abuse. Now, chicken or the egg, I don't know. But we do see substance abuse at higher levels in people with schizophrenia. Okay. And I say chicken or the egg, but there's also, substance abuse that is used for trying to self-medicate. Okay. So psychological treatments. Well, first we have cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy needs to be used in conjunction with antipsychotic medications. When you have someone with schizophrenia, they need to be on medications. You cannot, with just talk therapy, fix, if you will, schizophrenia. Okay? So cognitive training. The idea is this. We can't talk somebody out of a delusion or a hallucination, right? We don't talk them out of it. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm Jesus, you're like, okay, well, here's the thing. If you go out and tell everybody that you're Jesus, then people may not react very well to you. So although let's talk about in what situations it's appropriate to talk to people about this and what situations it's not appropriate to talk to people about this, okay? If we have somebody who comes to us with a persecutory delusion, we want to reduce the stress. We may say, look, there's a chance that people are talking about you, and I know that it feels like they are. But so far, nobody has actually harmed you, and there's a chance that they're not trying to. So let's figure out ways to go about life, and we want to reduce the stress related to those delusions. Okay, we want to reduce the stress related to the preoccupation. I had a client once who was so upset because he was so afraid that he was going to do something. He was afraid that he was going to take his private parts out and show them to people in public. He never had. He didn't want to. He thought that was wrong. He was never going to actually do this. But the idea and fear that he was going to do it caused him so much stress every single day. And so in therapy, we would talk about how he's never done this before. How would he feel if somebody else did that? Oh, he would think that was terrible. Okay, so there's that, right? Like, trying to remind him that he's a good person. He was not ever going to do that. He had never done it before, and sort of trying to reduce the stress around that. One way that we reduce stress and preoccupation, honestly, is with walking and listening to music. We do these other things that distract the person. We do these things to make sure that, somebody is generally doing okay, right? One of the other things that we do here is the token economy. And with the token economy, the idea is that we are teaching people how to behave appropriately in society, right? Like it's like training anybody to act appropriately in society, right? We may say, okay, well, in order to ask for this, you don't just, yell applesauce. You say, may I have some applesauce? And for each time that they do it appropriately, we give them a token or a coin, right? And then eventually they can trade their coins in or tokens in for some sort of prize. Or just that they feel good that they've been able to accomplish a goal. Okay, so that is a token economy, also called contingency management. All right. From the sociocultural perspective, we have this focus on the family system. What we often see is these faulty modes of behavior and communication within the entire family. We need everybody on board with working with the individual who has schizophrenia. There's a term that's used often in this work, and it's called expressed emotion. People high in expressed emotion are people who shout often, whether they're happy or they're sad. They express their emotion a lot. It's big time, right? And people that are low on expressed emotion keep their feelings to themselves, and they keep their voices down no matter what they're talking about. And, usually people are somewhere on that spectrum. Interestingly, we see if an individual goes back to a home where there is a high degree of expressed emotion, the person is more likely to relapse. So we work with the family on lowering some of that expressed emotion, okay? So there's that. We also work with the family to understand the patient's cognitive distortions. We work with them to understand that they don't need to talk them out of it. They just need to work with it or work around it, okay? We work with the family on frustration levels and being critical. If you come home and you're in an environment that's highly critical, then you're more likely to relapse, okay? Social class and income. Worse outcomes with schizophrenia are associated with environmental stressors of poverty. Contracting the disease meaning schizophrenia, leads to social and economic downward drift. The idea is that the person then doesn't have a job, and so then they live in poverty, and then they're around other people who live in poverty, and they slowly, that downward drift economically and socially. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, there are flow charts in your book that will explain downward drift. Okay. Sociocultural treatment. So the assertive community treatment is fabulous, but so expensive. It's a team of professionals from psychiatry, psychology, nursing, social work to reach out to clients. So at the residential place that I worked, you had people that lived there. And when they were able to move out on their own, at first, they still had to come back each day to be given their medications. And if they didn't show up, somebody reached out and found them and brought them in, and we start over. So again, they have to come in, 2 or 3 times a day to get their medications. Once they do that for a while and show that they can do that, they reach the next level, which is they come in for what you call a daily stick. And that is in the mornings, they get their medication for the whole day, and they're trusted to go off and make sure they take them. Eventually they can, work up to getting a week's medication at a time and on from there. But the idea is that everybody is involved in working together and really caring about the well-being of that person. But like I said, this is a lot of people and it costs a lot of money, so it doesn't happen as often as it should. And of course, finally, as always, we go to the biopsychosocial perspective. Theories focus on underlying brain mechanisms as expressed in cognitive deficits. Individuals with these disorders receive integrated care, right? Which maximizes the chances of recovery. Okay. All right. We are going to stop with that. Make sure that you have read in the book. Make sure that you look up videos of anything that you heard about today and want to see. Obviously being cautious of accidentally watching something you don't want to watch on YouTube. And you can always choose to watch documentaries on schizophrenia. There are some good ones out there. Okay, I'll leave you with that.